Well, let's go back to one of our main stories. The news that cabinet ministers are discussing whether to back controversial plans to expand Heathrow Airport. Supporters believe the proposals are crucial for economic growth, but opponents warn of the impact on climate change and noise pollution. Well, we can talk now to the former head of media for Heathrow, Andrew Teacher, who now runs Blackstock Consultancy. Thank you very much for coming in. We have been around the houses so many times on Heathrow, haven't we? And it wasn't actually that long ago that David Cameron was pledging that the Tories would no longer support the expansion of Heathrow, and he said no ifs, no buts. But we are finally here, and it looks like it's going to go ahead. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, my thoughts are that the swings and roundabouts that you've just described are the very essence of the problem with transport, with healthcare, with social housing, and with aviation. The fact that nobody can take a long-term view, nobody can put politics aside, and nobody can think beyond their current payback period, which is 5 years for politicians, 3 years for shareholders and FTSE 100 bosses. And what that means in plain English is unless we can take a long-term view and say, where do we want to be in 20 years, we're not going to have the airport capacity we need. And that's the same goes for rails. We're seeing the chaos this week. The same goes for social housing. Again, Grenfell is your second item today, and we're seeing the same thing with energy, again, much discussed over the last few days as well. And I think that, you know, from their perspective, anybody living locally to a big development project, whether it's infrastructure or housing, is very rarely going to want it to happen because of the impact on their roads, on their noise, and on local disruption, and that's understandable. But I think we have to take a bigger picture approach to this sort of stuff, and the dilly-dallying and the way that we play politics with these things, it's stymieing progress. And I think the upshot of that is that people will be worse off. You know, ultimately, everybody wants to go on holiday, and everybody broadly supports the idea of economic growth. And if you look at what the World Economic Forum has been talking about in recent months around majority of new jobs being created in mega cities, those mega cities aren't going to be able to be reached by point-to-point air travel. And that, you know, really brings into question much of what Justine Greening, one of the former transport secretaries we've had, who ridiculously has opposed Heathrow, what Justine Greening told Radio 4 this morning. She said that we don't need hub airports, we need point-to-points. And part of the problem here is that the public doesn't really understand this argument. A hub airport doesn't really mean anything. And what a hub is a big airport where the big planes feed the smaller ones. So it means that you can have lots of different routes to all sorts of different random places because you've got economies of scale created by the big feeder routes that go to Doha and Middle Eastern cities and New York. And these are the big trump cards for companies like British Airways. And because we have the scale that Heathrow offers, it means that businesses and holidaymakers alike have a massive choice of being able to fly at different times of day to all sorts of places, and that will be amplified by another runway at Heathrow. And you're obviously putting the big picture about the nation's economy and national interests in expanding Heathrow. Those living around it who are deeply concerned and who have been campaigning, and the politicians who campaign against it for reasons including noise pollution and other pollution, would say it might say, you know, it's easy for others to say it when they're not affected, when it's not in their backyard. Well, it's not. It isn't less or more or less easy to say. You know, ultimately, there'll be a lot of people. A lot of people. It's a matter of fact, not anything else. That a large part of the community is employed by it, and I would also wager that the airport was there before many of the people that live there. Now, that isn't meant to undermine the arguments. Of course, there is a major concern around climate risk, and nobody would wish to lessen that argument. But ultimately, technology is improving, and people are still going to fly. Whether we build the airport at Heathrow or we build it somewhere else, people aren't going to stop flying to Asia and stop flying to New York as the economy and the global nature of that economy grows. And I think what we have to do now is take a long-term view on this and combine the way we look at airports with energy so that we can create a greater and more sustained focus on green energy, and also look at the broader benefits of clustering infrastructure together. So if we're investing in another runway at Heathrow, we can think about the logistics of global trade. Again, everyone's buying stuff online. How does that get here? It doesn't float here, much of it. A lot of it does come through air freight. and also think about housing and other such infrastructure that does need to have a long-term investment. And ultimately, whatever your views on this stuff, and we're totally apolitical on this, we have to put politics aside. We have to stop the political point scoring that undermines long-term investment in transport, in healthcare and in housing.
Andrew Teacher, thank you very much. Let's get more on the news that regional papers across the north of England